In the cities, these industrial cities in particular, there began to develop noticeable class distinctions. There had always been class distinctions, but we start to see class segregation, and with the influx of foreigners, particularly those from Eastern Europe, we begin to see distinct cultural as well as physical differences that translate into class distinctions. Let's look through the three classes that did develop during this period of industrialization. Now, there had always been a working class. We can look back to the earlier part of the 19th century and see how the working class developed from at first a tradesman, potential journeyman, potential master situation into merely the operatives of machinery or the makers of small things. These early tradesmen learned skills, and they as apprentices, and then perfected those skills as journeymen until they became masters. But beginning about 1825, we see that the journeymen no longer became masters. They owned their own tools, but with the development of larger scale industry, those tools and those skills tended to become obsolete, or they were provided by the capitalists, the owners. And so ultimately, a working class of what Karl Marx would have called proletarians developed, with few skills, but mostly with their labor to sell. Some of these people developed skills, but they did not have to go through lengthy training. They did not ever develop what earlier people would have called a quote unquote competence. They would have gone from job to job and learned the skills they had to learn and make money that way. In fact, many times what we don't realize is these folks they may have worked long days, but they didn't work all the time. They may have had 3 to 6 months out of work in any particular year as their industry retooled. And this was a common problem, led to a great deal of poverty. With the influx of country people into the cities, and with the influx of foreigners, we find the development also of a working class culture. Sometimes it was a strange ethnic culture, but it almost always focused on the saloon. That's not because people drank so much. They drank a lot, but it wasn't because it was necessarily an alcoholic culture, but because there was no place else to meet. And this was saloons tended to be pubs in the English sense of the word, a meeting place. There developed also ethnic cultures around public amusements and spectator sports. Let's talk about this rise of working class amusements for just a minute, because amusements and culture tend to reinforce one another. There was, with the influx of immigrants into the city, both rural immigrants and particularly foreign immigrants into the industrial city, we find a bifurcation of the formerly shared culture. That is, as late as the 1860s and the early 1870s, but particularly true in the 1840s and 50s. Americans all knew Shakespeare, for example. They shared the same religious traditions, and there wasn't this difference between a high culture and a low culture. That began to develop with the influx of immigrants, and particularly with the development of an industrial middle class of managers and professionals who we'll talk about in just a minute. But opera enjoyment and the enjoyment of Shakespeare began to become something that the middle class and the upper class had. And in fact, examining Shakespeare to the point where you could enjoy it stopped being something that was relatively common and started being something that the universities provided education in. You had to develop taste in order to enjoy what became high culture. At the same time, the working class developed their own lower culture that focused on things like blood sports, boxing, dogfighting, cockfighting, things like that. It focused also on team sports, particularly baseball. Amusement parks were something new under the sun and a great gathering place for the working class, particularly those who were trapped in the cities, except on weekends when they could take a little bit of money and go out to the amusement park, see and be seen, and have a little bit of fun. Vaudeville replaced opera and Shakespeare and other kinds of uplifting plays. Although Shakespeare was kind of the vaudeville of his time, vaudeville proper began with the ethnic working class moving into the city. And then, of course, movies. When movies developed, first the Nickelodeon and then short features, then feature films, we find that was principally a working class diversion. And in fact, it was railed against by many middle class reformers as something that was beneath most members of the middle class, something that was unsavory and you should not engage in. The other end of that spectrum, and the owners of capital that were the other half of the fight between labor and capital during the Gilded Age, was the wealthy, and particularly during the Gilded Age, the nouveau riche. That is, people who were not from old money, but from new money. As longtime Senator John Sherman said about the nature of the wealthy, where, quote unquote, where formerly we spoke of wealth being in the thousands, we now speak of it in the millions. That is, instead of being thousandaires, like, for example, the old Knickerbocker families of New York, wealth was determined in terms of millions of dollars. And out of the 1,500 or so millionaires in the United States in 1890, 1,300 of them lived in Manhattan. Now, I don't mean to keep focusing on New York, but there was this concentration of industrial wealth, and there was battles between the families of older money and the families of newer money. This was the time in which Thorstein Veblen, the great American sociologist, began discussing his concept of conspicuous consumption, people that bought things just to show off, or as our more modern bumper sticker might say, he who dies with the most toys wins. What kind of conspicuous consumption are we talking about? Uptown homes. We see this in New Orleans. We see it in the developments just outside of Atlanta. We see it particularly in Uptown New York in the 20s, 30s, 40s along Fifth Avenue. These houses were enormous. You can see the Astor House Art Gallery. This is the art gallery for somebody's house, the Astor home. And of course, these houses had to be maintained by very large staffs. And that was a great signifier of great wealth, was how large your house was and how large your staff was. The Astor House merged with the Waldorf house, which was right next door to it, to become the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which in the 1920s was torn down and moved to its present location and replaced by the Empire State Building. But those two started out as private homes in the middle of a private home neighborhood of the well-to-do on Fifth Avenue in New York. First thing, Veblen also gave us the notion of conspicuous leisure. It was another concept like conspicuous consumption, but instead of merely consuming objects, Veblen understood that the nouveau riche tended to consume leisure as well. So we see the development of an industry of, first of tourism, destination tourism, and then we see the nouveau riche, particularly of New York and Boston, summering in Newport, Rhode Island, which became a destination for the well-to-do and their servants. And we see the development of what we would call today the A-list of people you invite to a party if you're a celebrity or well-to-do. And in the 1880s and 1890s, this was called the 400. Very much unlike the modern movie The 300, which was about warriors. The 400 was a list of people who Mrs. Astor would invite to her parties. It was the creme de la creme of the who's who of millionaires and well-off folk, primarily in New York. And the 400, that number was determined by the number of people who could fit comfortably in her entertainment room, in her party room. So this goes to demonstrate that a whole society grew up around the concept, a wealthy society grew up around the concept of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure, creating these signifiers of the ownership of wealth. The most important class to emerge from the Gilded Age, and this class became the dominant class in the progressive era and throughout the 20th century, was the middle class. Neither workers nor particularly wealthy. The middle class grew from the old professions of the ministry, university professors, lawyers, and doctors, but they added into their number industrial managers and small business people who were not out of the working class. They weren't saloon owners. They weren't little shopkeepers. They were bigger than that, but they were independent business people. The middle class had enough income that they could live comfortably, that they could begin to add some of the signifiers that we understand as being middle class signifiers today. For example, a college education is a signifier of middle class status. That means that you can afford to defer the income that you would not have or that you do not have from those same hours that you devote to study. You could be working and earning an income, but you are choosing to study. It's an investment in your future in hopes of repaying your student loans and of earning enough over the course of your life to have made this worth it for you. Also, you have to pay tuition for it, so there's a double whammy as far as being a signifier of middle class status. Well, things were a signifier, attitudes were a signifier, services were a signifier, and we see that this middle class, particularly in its early years, developed as we would consider, or what we would consider to be Victorian attitudes. They were thrifty, they were responsible, they were self-reliant. These were values that were good and proper. They were also private. They put great store in domesticity and in houses that reflected their taste and that were particularly crowded, as you can see in this bric-a-brac filled house right here, which is pretty typically middle class, maybe a little bit upper middle class. The middle class were, as a group, socially somewhat enthralled by the wealthy. In many cases, they aped the styles of the wealthy, though not as extreme, but they were also, as we'll see a little bit later on, profoundly ambivalent about their relationship with the wealthy. Ultimately, during the Progressive era, we will see the middle class assert its dominance not only over the working class socially and politically, but we will see it use the government to assert its dominance over the wealthy as well. That is, disciplining both the workers and the owners in industrial capitalism and carving out a space for themselves, becoming the dominant culture in that era. Well, in disciplining working class culture, we see the development of a middle class culture war, very similar to the culture wars that went on throughout the 1990s politically and are still going on today politically. Some of these, two of the people I'm showing you here are Jane Addams, social worker of Hull House, who developed pretty much the entire concept of the settlement house, and Anthony Comstock, whose claim to fame was that he was a campaigner against pornography as he defined it, which could also be political radicalism. Anyway, we see three kinds of attempts, three branches of a general middle class attempt to discipline working class culture and working class people. And again, remember, this is a survey class, so we're just going to bip over the top of this. We're not going to dig deeply into it, but it's a pretty fascinating mechanism that occurred in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, 1900s. One of these thrusts was to provide middle class approved alternatives to vice, rather than having only the saloon where men could gather in the working class. We find these middle class reformers creating the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, in order to provide meeting places that were alcohol-free and vice-free for those people in the city who found themselves in the cities and did not really want to participate in the bar culture and the saloon culture. Another alternative device was the Moral Uplift campaign. Things like the Salvation Army and the COS, the Charity Organization Society, which was an early attempt by middle-class reformers, primarily women, to provide welfare outside of the political patronage and political boss system to deserving families as they defined them. Also, the settlement house movement was part of this social uplift campaign. I'm sorry, I've gotten my slide a little bit confused here. And then that was the second thrust, was that social uplift campaign that you see before you, Salvation Army, Charity Organization, Settlement House. The third thrust is the suppression of vice. Anthony Comstock was a campaigner against pornography going through the mails, and ultimately he became the go-to guy for actual suppression of mail delivery. If he didn't like it, as the postal inspector in New York, then it didn't go through the mails. He also got various localities, a number of states, and even the federal Congress to pass anti-pornography laws that allowed for a broad definition of pornography to include political radicalism. And then this allowed postmaster generals to withhold mailing privileges from certain organizations. These were universally referred to as Comstock laws. Charles Parkhurst created the Moral Purity Campaign, which got individuals to pledge to remain morally pure in that kind of small town mentality that many reformers feared would be lost, that small town values were lost in the anonymity of the big city. And people like Charles Parkhurst wanted to reinforce that by getting people to pledge to be morally sound. And then we have the prohibitionists, not temperance people, but actual prohibitionists who wanted to get rid of alcohol and saw alcohol as the bedrock of most of the other vices of the city and of working class culture. And an example of that kind of organization is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. There were others like Carrie Nation, who attacked saloons with hatchets and broke open kegs of beer and alcohol. But the WCTU was a protest, suppression of vice, and a social uplift organization as well. Okay, so we've seen the development of classes, the development of a working class, the development of a middle class, the development of an upper class, and the attempt by the middle class in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s to impose its value system on the working class. This concludes our lecture. Thank you very much.